Hey, this is Huck. If you want to watch this top three asshole keep doing esports content, subscribe to Thorin's YouTube channel.
Ever since my boy Semler joined the Overwatch League, his casting has been the difference maker in making me feel more comfortable watching the game, which came as a surprise. I figured things could get a bit dicey when he came over. I was even worried it would just get deleted, but his transition has been so sick. It's like how esports pools reigns supreme in the fantasy and betting world. Their service is such a beast, and you better believe it, they are styling on them when it comes to the opposition. Whether you're trying to figure out who's going to get his face ripped off or just barely get the frags, they have the contests and matches on their service ready and waiting for you. All you got to do is be clicking buttons. Will Houston get rocked when they play Seoul? Because, by the way, this was supposed to be one of the best Western teams. As I say that, they are, of course, struggling, and perhaps they are not too long for this world. In the end, if you play there, you'll be the one left thinking to yourself, there it is. Now, the Korean creep in the Overwatch League is not some sort of expose about a coach or a player who is really dodgy in DMs. We'll leave a lot of that to the Ilbay boys over in Apex, over in OGN. No, my point is, I'm talking about in the same sense as power creep, that concept that comes from collectible card games and MOBAs. It's the notion that more and more Korean players find their way over into the Overwatch League, more are added to the league, and it looks as though more will be added in the future. Because this is something I alluded to in a past video, which was called, I think it was called like the Korean issue with the Overwatch League, or in the Overwatch League. And one of my points within it, kind of two of my main points were that the Overwatch League would immediately have an issue when it came to Koreans because you can't recruit all the best Koreans because some of them are going to still be in Korea and some of them you won't know about and will be in Korea and will develop and you won't therefore have them in the Overwatch League, so you won't have all the best players. But also, then you'll be in a scenario where if you do recruit all the Koreans, you won't have as many spots for Westerners, and presumably a lot of the Western fan bases who they want to watch the league, and those people at least profess or claim that they want to watch Western players, not just Koreans. Then I also alluded to the fact that Korean talent might degrade when they go outside of Korea. That one admittedly is a lot harder to tell. The Korean team still look fantastic in the Overwatch League. Also, it does seem as though their scrimming approach has offset some of that. For example, some of them, London Spitfire most notably, some of the other teams in terms of having enough players, can actually scrim against each other. Obviously, New York Excelsior can't. So that's also a way to actually get an advantage in scrimming that some of the other teams, especially the non-Korean teams, do not have whatsoever. And I would go ahead and assume, without having a lot of inside information, that relationships between the Korean teams means they get regular practice against each other when they're not about to play each other. So I wouldn't even be surprised if they have offset some of the issues of not being in Korea in that sense. Now, on the first issue, the fact that you can't recruit all the Korean players and therefore you're either going to lack Korean players or if you attempt to, you're not going to have any spots left for other people, that's a real issue. Because when you do recruit more Koreans, you end up with less Westerners and you end up having to perhaps even remove Westerners entirely. So you look at the recruitment and the creep of Koreans that's happened since the Overwatch League teams were first leaked. So first of all, I made a list in the other video of players that I thought that they could sign and that were obvious people to sign. Now, 3 of those people have been signed or are going to come in. So I pointed out already that Flower obviously will at some point in time play for New York Excelsior. He's just too young. So okay, he's still waiting in the wings. But already, Saya player, formerly DPS player of Meta Athena, has been added. He's joined the Florida Mayhem. You've had, obviously, Bunny actually got added early on to Seoul Dynasty. DPS player, formerly of Lunatic High, BK Stars. They actually have added, aside from those 3 names, 8 more Koreans who are fresh to the league. So we've got Awesome Guy was added, I think he's a tank player, right, over to Florida Mayhem. We had 3 players, Fearless, Gaguri, and Ado, who were added to the Shanghai Dragons. I think that's Tank, Flex, and a DPS. And you had Gambler, who joined the Seoul Dynasty. You had Tizzy, who, actually that went under the radar a bit, but he just joined London Spitfire. You had OGE, who joined the Dallas Fuel. And you most recently had Architect joined or was signed by the San Francisco Shock. Now, even within the Overwatch League, we've had a couple of notable transfers from the all-Korean teams down to non-all-Korean teams. So we had Fisher, tank player, come over from Spitfire to the Gladiators. And we also had Spitfire sell another player, Jack Etienne, fucking killing the game right now. Not only win the league, but straight up just murking people by selling off players and having them in the shop window. He also sold Rascal, DPS player, to the Spitfire, from Spitfire to the Fuel, rather. So of the new signings in the Overwatch League, 9 of the 14 were Korean. Then you look at how many Koreans are in the Overwatch League at this point in time. Well, there are a total of 54 of the 126 players in the Overwatch League are Korean. That is 42.86%. There are 3 teams that are all Korean and were from the beginning. So there's Seoul, who had 12 out of 12 players Korean, London, 11 out of 11, and New York, 8 out of 8. But you go beyond those players, because those players only make up, let's see, 31 of the 54 players in the Overwatch League who are Korean. There are 9 teams that have 3 or more Koreans. So that includes the other 3. So there's 6 teams outside of the all-Korean teams that have at least 3 Korean players. Boston has 4 players. Philadelphia has 4 players. Dallas has 3 players. Valiant has 3 players. Gladiators has 3, but I actually remove one. I don't count Bishu as like Korean in that sense. He's lived in America for a long time. He's played in the NALCS for fuck's sake. He's someone who you'd think of actually culturally somewhat as a Korean, or American rather, or at least half and half. So I don't think it's as reasonable to suggest he's Korean outright in that sense. So it depends how you categorize it. Shanghai now has 3 Koreans, and they're a Chinese team. 11 of the 12 teams in the Overwatch League have a Korean player. Because Florida Mayhem now has 2, San Francisco has 1. But when the Overwatch League began, so 11 teams now have a Korean. When the Overwatch League began, only 8 of the 12 teams had Koreans. Florida, Shanghai, and San Francisco all added players recently. Only 1 team in the entire Overwatch League doesn't have a Korean player, and that is the Houston Outlaws, who 0 of their 11 players are Korean, and at the moment, they are a team in free fall who is doing quite badly, even though, yes, in Stage 1, they were the best Western team and actually were able to get into the playoffs. Part of the issue here is not only has there been Korean creep already, and all signs point towards the most of the transfers being Korean, and every team pretty much adding Koreans except Houston, even Shanghai Dragons, but I actually think this is just going to be a trend that continues. You're going to get even more Koreans signed. I mean, if you look at it already in terms of the transfers that have been made, and they've been made in terms of both quantity and quality, Koreans are the perfect solution right now to shore up or improve your team. So look at Florida. They were a team that were an all Nordic team. Now they've added Sire player, DPS player. They've obviously fantastic player. They've added awesome guy as a tank. LA Gladiators were a mid-table team in Stage 1 who were free-falling by the end. But you know what? They are now the best Western team by signing a Korean tank in Fisher from the London Spitfire, one of the best players in the league. Fuel added Rascal to help with some of their issues. They were primarily a all-Western team. Shanghai added 3 Korean players to help their matters, which obviously, I mean, they had good DPS players, but they needed a tank, they needed a flex. Shock added Architect as a DPS player, even though they have young players who are going to come in Super and Sinatra. Sinatra obviously is the DPS, Super is a tank. So these are 5 teams who've made changes who were not about Koreans. So Florida were an all-Nordic team, except Logix from Belgium. Then you had Gladiators, who, yes, they had Bishu, who I've already described as kind of a semi-Korean, and they had Asher, but aside from that, it was mainly Westerners. It was mainly people that Bishu had picked and that, in theory, he'd scouted out and that he wanted. Fuel was mainly, they were known as a collection of the best Western talent, plus, yes, Effect is a Korean, and then Mickey, who is just not Western, is he? So I have to include him in that sense. But they were supposed to be one of the hopes of the West. Shanghai should have been Chinese forever, because there's only one Chinese franchise. There's no Chinese players being signed by other teams because obviously they're not going to have great English and they're not Korean. So if you're going to take a gamble, you take a Korean. So logically, with one Chinese franchise, you'd think they'd be one team that would be 100% non-Korean forever. They've already added 3 players that are Koreans, and that's despite the fact that adding Koreans when you primarily speak Chinese and they primarily speak Korean and English means you don't have a native shared language. You don't have a shared language, rather. You're going to have to use English, which is going to be a second or third language for all your players. I can tell you from how the LPL works in League of Legends. That has not been very good, and very rarely has there been a good level of communication in that sense. Usually you have to get a Korean coach to smooth out some of the issues there, and or the Koreans tend to be such fucking ballers at preparation and hard work that they just start learning Chinese to fit in the team. That's how nuts these guys are. So Shock also was another team that was supposed to be all about Western talent, including bringing forth these young players. And Monty has said many times about how their whole plan was to develop young talent. What do you know? They've already gone and added a Korean player, a young Korean talent, to add to their team to try and get them towards the top of the table instead of hanging around that bottom half of the table. Then you look at the other teams who have issues, and already it's Korean solutions you start to see. So Fuel need a tank now that XQC has been kicked out the league. And they're in a scenario where having Tai Mu play that role hasn't really worked out. They're apparently not ever bringing Coco back. It just seems like he's a fucking MIA forever. They've already got Effect and Rascal who are Koreans. You think about it, they need a tank and probably a Genji player, right? Because it didn't really work out having Seagull practice that. AKM hasn't really done that much. So who could they get as a tanker? Well, you could get Haxal from Runway. He turns 18 in October, so for season 2, he's got to be somebody you consider, right? You've got Kaiser, if you want to get a tank player, another former Runway player, now plays for Outlaws Contenders team, but if you know how the Contenders contracts work, if you've got the money, you can just make a better offer and get him, so he's another player you could add to your team. You look at the Outlaws team, they desperately need a Tracer. Okay, admittedly, they've been anti-Korean or pro-Western only in their approach, so you would expect them not to bother getting a Korean. But unless there's someone else out there who's going to be a brilliant Tracer, bearing in mind, Tracer is not a role you want to get just someone competent. You want a very good player doing that. Otherwise, you're going to get eaten up by the elite Tracers in the league. Who is available? Well, the obvious solution is you go to Runway, and the former Runway team at least, and you say, I want Stitch to join my team because he is a fucking baller. And that would be the player get. And if you get him, all 12 Overwatch League teams will have a Korean. Then you look at the Valiant, probably need another DPS, right? They've got the whole scenario with Silk Thread just being MIA, and then what are they doing in terms of Grim Reality? So they probably need a DPS and or a support because Kariv's playing DPS at the moment, but that leaves you without capable supports in the same way. So what you're telling me, they're not going to get a Korean player. They've just got a Korean coach. It's even more likely they're going to get a Korean player. Then you've got to consider, this is how bad the Korean creep's gotten, that the all-Korean teams, if they want, can basically have a side business showcasing talent that they don't want as their main starters that they then sell off. So obviously Spitfire already did it with Rascal and Fisher. So the all-Korean teams could basically become like an underground railroad to get more Koreans in the Overwatch League as subs and then sell them off to the other teams once they're proven quantities who have played in the Overwatch League and that you've played against. So that's a great advertisement for talent, subbing these players in, showing they're capable, and then selling them on. Or if you're a Korean team, like New York Excelsior is an obvious example here, you can add even more players. They've only got 8 players on their roster and have an abundance of talent. Like, I think part of the reason why New York Excelsior for me is OP as fuck is they have amazing players at almost every position. Support not quite as crazy, I guess. But then they have these mad level of talent and depth where like they just keep Pine on the bench. Like Libero just is there to just fill holes. You have Flower hasn't even joined the league yet could be a future MVP of the league. Yet you've already got Sabiel B. You've already got these amazing fucking players in your team. I mean, you could also get more players in just to do that so that even the Korean teams can add more Korean players. Now, part of the problem here is not only is it the obvious solution, but the Korean success in the Overwatch League is indisputable. I know a lot of people wanted to believe, especially Western players and fans, that Koreans wouldn't dominate and they wouldn't just shit on everyone. They wouldn't be by far the best. I mean, at this point in time, unless you're going to set up the straw man that they were supposed to win every single game and never be threatened by even the best Western teams, which I don't know anyone who claimed that, by the way. No one was claiming that during Apex. This has gone pretty much the way you'd expect it to go. The 3 all-Korean teams, Spitfire, Seoul Dynasty, and New York Excelsior, have collectively gone 44-13 in all the matches they've played, so including the stage playoffs. Of those 13 lost matches, only 6 of the 13, so the minority, were against teams who aren't all Korean. So New York lost to Philadelphia in Stage 1 Week 3. London lost to Boston in Stage 1 Week 3. Seoul lost to Valiant in Stage 1 Week 5. London lost to Houston in Stage 1 Week 5. In Stage 2, there's only been 2 losses so far, and we only have 1 week left to play. London lost to Houston in Stage 2, Week 1, and London lost to Gladiators in Stage 2, Week 3. The all-Korean teams, assuming I haven't fucked up my maths here, have collectively won 37 out of 43 games played. 86% of their matches they have won against non-Korean, as in not all Korean teams. 86% win rate collectively, the 3 of them. And it's not like these Korean teams were pre-packaged and therefore just should have dominated from day one. No. They're in a position where someone like Fuel had their core together longer than some of these squads. London, okay, came in with 2 full elite squads, Apex champions. But they've mixed them over time and even sold off some of those good players. Seoul had a new squad with an old core, but they had to work out what they were going to do with their DPS players and change it up. And they obviously had issues with people like Miro in the stage 1. Then you had New York Excelsior. They were a team that had a lot of talent. We've always known that from the LW Blue days. But then they added in people like Libero. Then they had to figure out how they're going to work this out. Added in new players like Jonak who hadn't played competitively before. And they had to put it all together. So none of these teams had this big advantage you'd expect in that sense. There's also an issue that another reason you'll get more Koreans is the more Koreans you have, the more Koreans you are likely to want to get or be tempted to get, because Koreans tend to work and live better together. If you have one Korean, he's not going to be as happy culturally as if you got 2 or 3, so they can have a little clique of their own. They're obviously going to play better together because they're already fantastic players, but then they're going to communicate directly. And then you've got to add in, there's Korean coaches in the league now. So when you have Korean coaches, they are going to naturally see Koreans as simpler solutions, especially if it means they know people back in Korea who are being hyped up as good players who haven't been signed yet, and that's who we can sign without any sort of matching a contract or a buyout. Now, 10 teams of the 12 in the Overwatch League have some form of Korean coach. 7 of those 10 are obviously not the all-Korean teams. Admittedly, one of them is Outlaws, who is a team who apparently has not wanted Koreans so far. So, okay, maybe take that out of the equation as maybe they won't sign them. But there's 6 more teams where the likelihood is you might end up seeing more Koreans in those teams. Then you've got to add in another reason why is a lot of those coaches have past teams and past relationships with other Korean players that they don't have with Westerners. So they're going to naturally see those people as the obvious things to fill a hole or to provide a solution to a problem that a team has. Then you look at some of those players I listed off in the last video, so many of them aren't signed. A couple of them, okay, Haksal, who are you? Because they were too young. But there's so many other players out there. If someone's looking for a Zarya player, if that becomes a big deal again, we all know Hoon from Meta Athena. He's in Meta Bellum at this point in time. Then, as I said, if you want a Tracer, you get Stitch. Obviously, you have 6 support player who can DPS and Cox, right? Then you have Bumpers as a Lucio player over on Cox back in the day. You have Recry from Afrika Blue as a DPS if you want more DPS talent. As I said, you've got Kaiser. You've got Void, who was on Kongdu Panthera, flex player. You got One Fact as a DPS from MVP Space. There's a whole bunch of people out there still who could be signed. And remember, more Koreans means less Westerners or less future Westerners added to the league. Now, for me, that's not an issue. I just love watching the best players play any game. And if they're going to be Korean, so be it. Let's add more. But it's a big issue for what people presented as the premise behind geolocation. That you would somehow cheer for these players because you liked watching Western talent and that this was big, that they had to in some way tie into the area you came from. If that's a big issue for some people, then it's going to be a problem because this is going against the grain of what you wanted. It's also an issue in terms of marketability because, first of all, a lot of the Koreans don't tend to have a big personality. Now, that can help you in as much as they, in theory, shouldn't get into trouble as much, but it's not as easy to have them stream on the side or to build up names like Jake, like some of the players on the Fuel team, which already, they still have some bigger names than some of the fantastic players on Seoul, on Spitfire, who some of them, I bet people would forget the fucking name if you didn't say, if you asked them, who's the second support player for the London Spitfire? I don't think a lot of people could name you some of that shit. Then you've got to add in, when they do try to build up their personality and try to put themselves out there, there's going to be issues of controversy because they come from a different culture. They don't know the rules in the same way. Also, the rules are changing all the time in the West anyway, thanks to fucking social justice warrior culture and Blizzard repeatedly bending the fucking knee to a bunch of people who don't even care about the Overwatch League and just come to get hits and controversy. Then you've got this scenario where another reason why I could see controversy hitting more Korean players in the future is I know from being in games like League of Legends, like StarCraft, Brood War, and StarCraft 2, that a funny thing that people like to do when Western players become friends with Korean players is in private, you teach them swear words, you teach them rude things, you teach them to be a bit BM. But if any of that leaks out publicly, as you saw with Tyrone making that nuke joke, the end of the fucking world can happen. And by the way, Koreans have a very different cultural sensibility. Let me just tell you a quick story. In StarCraft Brood War, the first StarCraft game, which was a massive game in Korea for all of the 2000s, it was a fully televised game, used to get big viewership, used to have like 10,000, 20,000 people at some of the live finals. That game used to have a setup where when you got the groups decided in the 1v1 leagues, you would sometimes have like ceremonies where you came in to be introduced, and then you would pick who was going to be in your group or banter a bit. At one of these, there was a player called Fantasy, a fantastic Terran player, one of the best players of all time, OSL champion, who played for SK Telecom, the biggest and the most prestigious team. And he was like one of the most famous players, one of the most beloved players. And when he came to one of these ceremonies, because his nickname was the Terran Terrorist, because he used to actually sometimes use this unit called Vultures to kind of like attack and do little sort of guerrilla tactics on the opponent, he came to one of these ceremonies dressed as Osama bin Laden. And his joke was like, haha, I'm a terrorist. Now in the West, that would be fucking outrageous if you did that in esports. But no one batted an eye in Korea. No one even thought it was controversial. He was never punished. He never apologized. Because you know what? It wasn't a big deal over there. So the problem is some of these Korean players, especially the newer ones, I actually worry a little bit that they can also get hit with bans and fines and especially get kind of backlash for controversy. Because we need them to put themselves out there to be marketable, to make up for the fact that it isn't a Western player who you naturally can connect with on basic levels of relating to someone who's to some degree your kin or looks like you or culturally shares some similarities with you. So the question now as well is, as you add more and more Koreans and as the trend becomes to add more Koreans, where do Western talents go? Because remember, until the Overwatch League ends for this season, there isn't a third-party circuit. There aren't MLGs and DreamHacks and ESL tournaments and big tournaments you can go in, prove yourself, keep up to date, have something to practice for. There's contenders, that's it. Which at the moment, I mean, not that many people watch the Overwatch League in the context of where it started at the beginning of Stage 1. So how are you going to show off your talents in contenders as much? Plus, people are scared to add people to their contenders team for fear that you can't actually protect them in any way and they can just go to another team if they turn out to be good. So it's kind of a rough scenario for the Western talents at the moment. Then you've got to ask yourself, okay, so at the moment, there's like 42% of players in the Overwatch League are Korean. What happens if we hit 60 to 70 to 75% Koreans in the Overwatch League? Now, sure, you might say, well, we'll add more franchises over time. I even think a solution in the future might be divide up the regions, as you've done in other games. I mean, I guess you're going backwards in Overwatch in this sense. Then again, though, that will make it worse, because then, yes, Western teams will do very well, but they won't test themselves against Koreans. They won't be in a scenario where we actually know if they're good enough, or they get to scrim against Koreans. So all the solutions bring their own problems with it. So at the moment, I'm loving it. I love watching these great players play. I don't really give a fuck about watching some of the players who are like talents from the Western scene if they can't produce the ability right now in the Overwatch League. When, by the way, everything's actually loaded for them to have their best chance to be successful entirely. The Korean teams, if anything, I think are only going to get better and refine their squads down even more. So the Korean creep in the Overwatch League is real. This video was supported by Dean Tanglis, Michael Allaire, Andreas Westerlund, Alex Adams, Gman, Twch, Jerky's Minion, Gianfranco Ingrata, Anthony, Bash, TGreb, Yordan, Tsenkov, Daniel Yordanov. Want to suggest guests or topics for my content? Well, keep it G-rated and unlock the code to the streets, gaining exclusive access via the Patreon link below. The Scrilluminati grows daily.